The Silent Challenge. The dojo was immersed in an almost sacred stillness, interrupted only by the rhythmic sound of the beginning students' breathing. Bruce Lee, standing in front of the class, demonstrated the basic movements of Jeet Kune Do with surgical precision. His eyes, dark and penetrating, took in every detail, the angle of his feet, the tension in his shoulders, the fluidity of his fists. He spoke little, but each word carried the weight of decades of discipline. It was then that the door opened with a bang. A tall man, with broad shoulders and an arrogant expression, entered the space as if he owned it. He wore a faded black kimono, tied loosely, and bore on his face the mark of someone who had already broken noses and egos in equal measure. His eyes swept the room until they found Bruce, and a sneer played on his lips. "Are you the master?" The voice was thick, full of provocation. "I heard you teach these kids how to fight. But where is the real combat?" The students looked at each other, some instinctively stepping back. Bruce, however, didn't move. He remained standing still, his hands relaxed at his sides, as if the intruder were nothing more than an uncomfortable breeze. "This is no place for fights," he said, his voice calm, almost soft. "If you want to test your strength, there are gyms for that." The warrior laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "Afraid of getting your hands dirty with a real student?" He took a step forward, his fists clenching. "Let's see if your fame is deserved." Bruce sighed, as if the situation was boring. Then, without warning, the air seemed to condense. The first movement was almost imperceptible, a slight shift of weight, a minimal turn of the hip. The second was a blur. His left foot rose in a side kick, quick as lightning, straight to the challenger's solar plexus. The man barely had time to raise his arms before the impact threw him against the wall. The third movement was Bruce's hand grabbing him by the collar before he collapsed to the ground. The fourth was a whisper in the warrior's ear, so low that only he heard. 4 seconds. That's how long it takes for a man to realize he doesn't know anything. Then, with a gentle push, Bruce released him. The man fell to his knees, his breathing ragged, his eyes wide no longer with arrogance, but with shock. The dojo remained silent. Bruce adjusted his kimono, as if nothing had happened, and turned to the students. "As I said, balance is everything." And he resumed class, as if the episode was nothing more than a forgettable parenthesis. Outside, the warrior stood up unsteadily, but before leaving, he took one last look at his master. There was something new in his eyes, respect. And perhaps, for the first time, humility. The weight of silence. The following days were marked by an invisible tension, like a thread stretched between the dojo walls. The older students felt the weight of that unspoken lesson, while the newcomers, still oblivious, trained with the same enthusiasm as always. Bruce, however, noticed everything. The way some avoided his gaze, how others stood straight up as they passed him, as if they expected their master to repeat the gesture, or worse, to challenge him again. The humiliated warrior did not return. But his presence remained, like a shadow that refuses to dissipate. Then, one damp morning, when mist still covered the temple grounds, a sealed envelope was left on Bruce's desk. Inside, just a sheet of thick paper, with a single line written in black ink. 4 seconds isn't enough to learn. But it's enough to die. Bruce calmly folded the paper, put it in the inner pocket of his kimono and left. There was no need to ask where it came from. You knew. The meeting was arranged in an old abandoned warehouse on the banks of the river, where the muddy water reflected the moon like a broken mirror. The warrior, whose name, it later turned out, was Kaido, waited in the center of the empty space, dressed not in his training uniform but in light armor of blackened leather, the short blades strapped to his back gleaming in the pale light. Around him, 6 men, all with the same cold eyes, the same calculated movements. "You didn't bring any students," Kaido said, without surprise. "Good. I don't want an audience for what's going to happen." Bruce stopped a few steps away, hands hanging loosely at his sides. "You didn't come for a fight. Came for an execution." Kaido smiled, a quick, almost imperceptible movement. execution is a strong word. Let's say I came to correct a mistake. You made me question my path. This is dangerous. A master cannot afford to leave doubts in his disciples. And a disciple cannot afford to confuse strength with wisdom, replied Bruce, his voice calm. Do you think beating me will prove you were right? No, Keto unsheathed one of the blades, the sound of steel cutting through the air like a sigh. I think it will prove that I was always right. The 6 men advanced at the same time. Bruce didn't move until the last moment. As the first blade came down towards his neck, he twisted his body in one fluid motion, using the attacker's own momentum to throw him off balance. The man flew over his shoulder and landed with a thud. Before the others reacted, Bruce had already grabbed the first sword and threw it at the second, sticking it in his shoulder. Kaido watched, motionless. You fight as if you already know what we're going to do. Because I know, said Bruce, dodging another blow and breaking a third's nose with a precise elbow. You were trained the same way. Same movements, same patterns. Predictable. The 5th man attempted a low attack, but Bruce jumped, using the wall to propel himself forward and kick his opponent in the chin with enough force to make him collapse. There were 2 left, the one holding the injured shoulder and Kaido. Enough, said the master, raising his hand. This is no longer a test. It's a lesson. Kato hesitated for a second, just a second, before attacking. His blade sliced through the air in a perfect arc, but Bruce was no longer there. He ducked, spun around and, with one swift movement, disarmed Kaido with a sharp blow to the wrist. The sword fell to the ground with a metallic clang. For seconds, Bruce muttered, holding Kaido by the collar of his armor, exactly as he had done in the dojo. That's how long it takes for a man to realize he doesn't know anything. You've had years to learn this. And yet, it failed. Kaido breathed hard, his eyes burning with anger and shame. Then kill me. Bruce released him. No. You're already dead. He died the moment he decided that strength was all that mattered. He walked away, picking up the fallen sword and offering it back, with the hilt facing Kaido. But if you want to live, start again. From scratch. Kaido looked at the weapon, then at the fallen men around him. Some were moaning, others were unconscious. He took the sword but did not lift it. Why let me go? Because humility is not a defeat, said Bruce. It's the first step to becoming something bigger. Kaido didn't return to the dojo. But months later, a young man with scars on his arms and a different look appeared among the students. He didn't say where he came from, nor who had taught him. Just trained. And, over time, it became one of the best. Bruce never mentioned what had happened. Neither do the other students. But sometimes, when the master demonstrated a particularly complex technique, his eyes would meet Kaido's for an instant. And there was there, in that brief contact, a silent understanding. Balance, after all, was not just a matter of posture. It was a matter of knowing when to fall. And when to get up. The weight of the blade. The years passed, and Bruce's dojo grew in fame. Students arrived from distant lands, attracted by the reputation of a master who not only taught techniques, but a philosophy. Kaido, now known as Shiro, the White One, because of the pale scar that marked his left forearm, was respected, but did not mix. He trained alone before dawn, sharpening not only his blade, but his patience. I had learned that true strength was not in winning, but in not being broken. One night, however, the balance that Bruce preached so much was put to the test. A messenger arrived at the dojo with news of a war in the north. A warlord, Daro Kyutin, had betrayed his ally and taken his lands, enslaving entire villages. Among those captured, it was said, was the daughter of a former disciple of Bruce, a man who had left the dojo years earlier to found his own school, but who maintained respectful ties with the master. The request was clear: help. Bruce gathered his older students, including Kaido. He didn't order anything. He just told the story and waited. Darokutin is a man who knows no limits, said one of the disciples, a warrior named Ren, whose hands were quick as the wind. Your fortress is impenetrable. If we go, it will be a suicide mission. Or a lesson, Kito replied, without looking up from the ground. Bruce watched the two. Ren was skilled, but his confidence bordered on arrogance. Kito, on the other hand, had learned to hide his strength under a mask of calm. The master knew that, among them, only one was ready for what was to come. We will not go as an army, Bruce said finally. We will go like shadows. The fortress of Darokutin stood on a cliff, its black walls reflecting the moonlight like sharp teeth. There were no guards on the walls, there was no need. The warlord relied on his traps, hidden pits, spinning blades in narrow passages, and, above all, his elite warriors, men trained to kill without hesitation. Bruce, Kito, and Rin advanced silently, avoiding the guard posts. But Ron, impatient, stepped on a loose board. The crack echoed like thunder. The torches lit up. Intruders! Roared a voice. Darokutin was not a tall man, but his presence filled the room. He wore black armor inlaid with the bones of his enemies, and in his hands, a curved sword, stained with dried blood. His eyes, small and bright, fixed on Bruce. The legendary Master Bruce, he said, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Has it come to join my collection? Bruce didn't respond. He just drew his sword, the blade reflecting the torchlight in a cold glow. Two of you. One of me, Darokutin said, snapping his fingers. Choose who will die first. Ron charged forward, his sword cutting through the air in a perfect arc. Darokutin dodged it easily, counterattacking with a blow that opened a tear in the disciple's shoulder. Ron fell to his knees, panting. Weak, spat the warlord. Like everyone who follows you, Bruce. It was then that Kito moved. Didn't attack. He didn't raise his sword. It just fell. His body collapsed to the side, as if he had been struck, and his blade slid across the ground, stopping at Darokutin's feet. The warlord laughed. Pathetic. But as he bent to pick up the sword, Kito spun on the ground, kicking his enemy's legs. Darokutin fell onto his back, and before he could recover, Bruce's blade pressed into his throat. Humility is not a defeat, said Bruce, echoing words spoken years before. It's the first step to becoming something bigger. Darokutin spat out blood. Kill me then. Or I will be the one to destroy them. Bruce didn't kill. Instead, he ordered his men released. The daughter of his former disciple was found in a damp cell, but alive. When she saw Bruce, her eyes filled with tears. Thank you, she whispered. But Bruce just shook his head. I wasn't the one who saved her. On the way back, Ren walked in silence, his pride hurt more than his shoulder. Kito, on the other hand, felt lighter, as if he had left a burden behind. You knew he would fall, Ron said finally, bitterly. Kito didn't respond right away. When he spoke, his voice was calm. I knew I would fall. The rest was luck. Bruce, who was walking ahead, smiled to himself. It wasn't luck. It was confidence. Confidence in knowing that sometimes falling was the only path to victory. Years later, Bruce's dojo no longer existed. The master had left on a journey of no return, leaving behind only legends. Kito, now a gray-haired man, taught at a small temple in the mountains. His students were few but dedicated. One night, a young man with scars on his arms appeared at his door. I want to learn, said the boy. Kito watched him for a long moment. Then, without a word, he handed him a wooden sword. First, learn to fall. The young man, who was called Haruto, grabbed the sword with trembling hands. The scars on his arms told stories of violence, some self-inflicted, some not. Kito didn't ask. I knew the questions would come with time, or not at all, and both options were acceptable. In the first few months, Haruto fell. He fell to his knees, on his back, on his side, always with a dull thud that echoed through the temple courtyard. Kato didn't help him get up. He just watched, like Bruce had once watched him. "Why do you only teach me how to fall?" asked Haruto one afternoon, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "Because before you know how to fight, you need to know that you can get up," replied Kaito. Haruto gritted his teeth. "I didn't understand. I wanted strikes, techniques, the promise of strength." But Kaito gave her nothing but the packed earth and the weight of his own body against her. One night, while the other students were sleeping, Haruto approached the temple's altar. Among the offerings of incense and dried flowers, there was an ancient, rusty sword, with a worn hilt. He held it, feeling the cold of the metal. It wasn't made of wood. It was real. "This isn't for you," Kaito said, emerging from the shadows. Haruto didn't let go of her. "Why not?" "I've fallen enough." Kaito approached. "You fell, but you haven't learned yet." "I learned that it hurts. I learned that it is humiliating. What else is there to know?" The master extended his hand. "Attack me." Haruto hesitated. Then, with a shout, he rushed forward. Kaito dodged it easily, using the boy's own momentum to knock him down. Haruto fell onto his back, the sword slipping out of his hands. "You didn't fall because I knocked you down," said Kaito. "You fell because you believed the sword was the answer." Haruto stood up, furious. "And what is the answer, then?" "There is no answer. There's only the floor. And you, in it." The two faced each other under the moonlight. Then, Haruto picked up the wooden sword from the ground and broke it in half against his knee. "No more falling." Kaito didn't move. "Then you will never fly." Haruto left the temple that night. He didn't come back for weeks. When he reappeared, he was thinner, his eyes were sunken. He was carrying an injured man with him, carried on his shoulders. "He tried to kill me," said Haruto, panting. "I knocked him down. But I couldn't kill him." Kaito helped lay the man down on the ground. "Why not?" "Because I knew what it was like to fall," replied Haruto. "And I didn't want him to feel that." Kaito nodded. "Now you understand." Years passed. Haruto became a master, not because of his sword skills, but because of his ability to teach others what it meant to lift. The temple grew, legends about the man who only taught how to fall spread. And when Kaito, old and hunched over, finally closed his eyes for the last time, it was Haruto who took the rusty sword from the altar and buried it at the foot of the mountain. "No more falling," he murmured, but this time, there was no bitterness in his words. Just peace. And so, the last lesson was taught. Legacy of the Void. The years haven't erased the scar on Haruto's shoulder, but they have softened its memory. The temple, once a forgotten ruin among the mountains, was now a refuge for those seeking more than fighting techniques. His students did not come to learn how to win, but to understand the weight of defeat. And, strangely, that was precisely what made them invincible. Among them, a young girl named May stood out. Not by force, but by stubbornness. She had arrived at the temple at the age of 12, after being expelled from 3 fencing schools for breaking the rules. Her previous master had said that she fought as if the sword were an extension of her anger, not her soul. Haruto had accepted her without hesitation. "You don't want to learn how to fall," he had said on the first day, as she tried, in vain, to hit him with a clumsy blow. "You want to learn not to fall." May had spat on the floor. "I want to learn to never lose." Haruto had smiled, a tired smile, and let her attack him again. And again. Until, exhausted, she fell to her knees, the sword slipping from her fingers. "Losing is not the end," he had said, extending his hand. "It's just the beginning." She had refused help. She stood up alone, her eyes burning with humiliation. But he returned the next day. Over time, May learned. Not fighting better, but breathing between blows. recognizing the moment when defeat was inevitable and, instead of resisting, using it as an impetus. Haruto watched her from afar, satisfied. She would be his last student, the one who would carry forward what he could no longer teach. But the world outside wasn't ready for lessons in surrender. One night, a messenger arrived at the temple, bringing news of a war in the east. A warlord, known for his cruelty, had unified the provinces under his banner and was now marching west, demanding loyalty. Those who resisted were executed. Those who surrendered, enslaved. "They will come here," said the messenger, panting. The warlord heard about the temple. "They say weakness is taught here." Haruto looked at the horizon, where the first lights of dawn were beginning to color the sky. "Weakness is not what we teach. He won't understand the difference. Then we'll have to show him." The army arrived at dawn. 100 men, armed to the teeth, surrounded the temple. At their head, mounted on a black horse, stood the warlord, his face marked by scars from past battles. He dismounted with a cold smile. "I heard that this place teaches men to bow," he said, his voice echoing among the stones. "Today, you will learn to kneel to me." Haruto left the temple, alone. He didn't carry a sword, just a wooden staff. Behind him, Mei and the other students watched tensely. "We won't fight," said Haruto, calmly. "But we won't kneel either." The warlord laughed. "Then they will die standing up." He gestured, and his men advanced. What happened next was not a battle. It was a lesson. Haruto didn't block the blows. He deflected them, letting the attacker's strength throw them off balance. When a soldier punched him, he fell but rolled to the side, using the movement to get up. As a sword sliced through the air toward him, he fell backwards, kicking his attacker's legs and making him stumble. The students followed his example. Mei, who previously would have retaliated with fury, now moved like water, flowing between attacks. She didn't knock down her opponents. She dropped them. Within minutes, the ground was covered with confused, disoriented men, some laughing without understanding why they had been defeated without a single killing blow. The warlord, in disbelief, drew his sword. "This is witchcraft." Haruto shook his head. "It's surrender." And then, with one swift movement, he disarmed the warlord, sending the sword flying away. The man fell to his knees, panting. "Kill me," he growled. Haruto looked at him for a long moment. Then he extended his hand. "Get up." The warlord hesitated. Then, slowly, he accepted the help. Years later, the temple was empty again. Mei had left to found her own school, where she taught not only the art of the sword, but the art of living. The warlord, now a changed man, ruled his lands with justice, and stories about the master who taught how to fall spread to distant kingdoms. Haruto, old and tired, sat on the edge of the cliff where Kaito had found him decades before. The wind was blowing strong, just like that day. He closed his eyes and remembered the sound of the sword cutting through the air, the impact of the fall, Kaito's voice saying, "Now you understand." I understood. And finally, I was ready to drop the last weight. He got up, walked to the edge of the cliff and let the wind carry him. There was no pain. There was no fear. Just the feeling of finally being free.